Thank you. So as Jim has said, Jared and I will be having a talk for up to about an hour. And then after that, there'll be some time for questions before we finish at 9 p.m. And Jared's very kindly agreed to sign books after that in the lobby. And I think we'll begin, Jared, if it's okay with you, just by asking you to, as it were, set out your stall as relates to this, the book, The World Until Yesterday, drawing out some of the, I guess, the key themes that you think it's interesting for us to know about. And if you can do that in sort of 5 minutes or so, then we'll go into, yes, exactly. So for those of you who haven't read the book, you might want to leave after 5 minutes because you'll basically get 500 pages worth boiled down very handily in the next few minutes. If I can ask you to do that for 5 minutes or so, we'll then follow a conversation reasonably organically, picking up on threads that come up, and we'll go from there. Jared.
I'll also begin by asking whether you can hear me okay in back. And in response to your suggestion, Robert, that I summarize my book in 5 minutes, I have some experience of that because when, as an academic, I encountered journalists, I found myself facing journalists who would say things like, Mr. Diamond, we know that you've written this 500-page book that took you 7 years and you put hundreds of articles and books into it, but you have to understand that our radio listeners and TV viewers and newspaper readers are busy people. So, Mr. Diamond, would you please summarize the last 11,000 years of history in one sentence?
Yes.
And
of course, I completely agree with that. So,
and I've learned how to do that. So, to summarize this book now in 3 minutes and 45 seconds, my latest book is about small-scale traditional tribal societies, which we forget. For the last 6 million years, all human societies have been small, tribal, without centralized government. And it's only within the last 5,000 years that we've developed our first state governments and writing and metal tools, so that the way we operate today is drastically different from how we operated throughout human history. Just as an example, Robert, you and I have met each other about an hour ago, and I can assure you that in the hour since I met you,
Hang on, what are you about to say?
I have not made any move to kill you, and I have not detected you're making any move to kill me. But in tribal societies, that would be unthinkable. In tribal societies, you live in an area surrounded by other people that you know so that you don't encounter strangers. And if you should encounter strangers, it would be someone there to encroach on your land to steal a pig or a woman, so that strangers are extremely frightening. That's just one example of what we are utterly used to today, dealing with strangers.
And you did just say pig or a woman, didn't you? We might have to come back to that.
I will add the point that in New Guinea, where I do my field work, they are interchangeable because you buy women with pigs, and when I started in New Guinea, it was 4 pigs per woman, but there's now inflation. So my book is about.
I'm not sure that resolves it, but we'll thank you. Thank you for the information.
That will do it as a start. A few battlers out there. So my book is about differences between what we take for granted in our modern societies and traditional societies, which includes that we are accustomed to encountering strangers, but traditionally that never happened, that our attitude towards danger today is entirely different and much more nonchalant than the New Guinea attitude towards danger, that we bring up our children differently, that we approach old age differently, that we die of different things. The vast majority of us here will die of non-communicable diseases like diabetes, stroke, heart disease. In traditional New Guinea, nobody ever died of one of those diseases. But that's also instructive because that's because of differences in lifestyle. And those of us who adopt a New Guinea-like lifestyle can minimize our risk of diabetes, stroke, heart disease. So those are just some examples of differences between traditional societies and modern societies. And now I've used my 3 minutes and 45 seconds.
Okay. Well, let me just pick up on a couple of things. I'll come back to women and pigs, but just to be clear, when you use the word traditional there a couple of times, it would help me, might help the audience too, just to understand exactly what you mean by traditional, and whether is that not just an artful euphemism for primitive, or are we not supposed to say that anymore? So perhaps you could help us with what traditional means.
It is true that we are not supposed to say that, but what that gets at is that traditional societies are really all the societies of the world until relatively recently, with the rise of state government, the rise of dense populations which permitted and required centralized government. So we are used to living in dense populations with government, with writing, with metal tools. Small-scale traditional societies lacked writing, central government, metal tools. And particularly over the last 11,000 years, traditional societies have been gradually modernizing to the point today where the last semi-traditional societies are to be found in parts of New Guinea and the Amazon, but even they are in transition. So New Guinea friends of mine would say, don't talk about traditional, talk about transitional societies.
Right. So this is an important point just to be clear on, I think, because the title "The World Until Yesterday" might lead us to think that when we look into these traditional societies, it's a bit like looking at a star. You're looking at the light that hasn't reached us yet, as though we're literally looking back into our own past, and those people have been frozen in time for thousands of years. But you're not quite saying that, are you? There is development in these traditional societies. There's change that's happening as well as fixity.
That's true, and as you, Robert, know from the titles of your own book, a title is either shorthand or it's a lie that's a stepping stone to the truth.
Yes.
It is true that all traditional societies today are in contact with the outside world. The traditional societies that were encountered within the last several hundred years of the European expansion, it's only on the Australian continent that they were hunter-gatherers surrounded by hunter-gatherers. So traditional societies today, they're marked by things including relatively simple technology, but they've all been influenced to varying degrees by modern industrial societies.
And presumably that process is kind of unstoppable now. I mean, what was traditional will become increasingly like what you see in non-traditional, broadly westernized societies?
You're right that it's unstoppable in two ways. In traditional societies in the past, before there were airplanes, the people in the highlands of New Guinea did not know that there was an outside world. They didn't know that there was an ocean. And then eventually, as airplanes came in, they realized that there were other things out there. But there's the phenomenon of first contact in which they actually encounter, for the first time, outsiders. The last groups of people in the world who have not experienced first contact, face-to-face contact with societies, with centralized government, are a few tribes left in New Guinea, both Papua New Guinea and Indonesian New Guinea, and more tribes in the Amazon. But probably within the next decade, something that has existed throughout all of human history, the phenomenon of first contact, the last first contacts will probably come within the next decade.
So you're saying in those particular examples, these are people who have literally had no contact beyond their own kith and kin, in the sense of being exposed to non-traditional societies.
That's correct. In New Guinea, an extreme example, the highlands of New Guinea, because New Guinea Highlanders were farmers and they were sedentary and they didn't travel more than, say, 10 miles from the place of birth. They did not know that there was an outside world. They received in trade from the coast cowrie shells, but they didn't know that cowrie shells came from the ocean. And when Europeans came in, there was, in the 1930s, one of the first European airplanes into the highlands of New Guinea, brought a New Guinean to the coast, a Highlander to the coast. He was astonished. He scooped up some water, salt water. He brought the salt water in a container back to the highlands to show people salt water, something that they had never encountered.
Extraordinary, isn't it? For those of you who've not read Jared's book, there's an extraordinary photograph of first contact of somebody from a tribe seeing a white face for the first time. And I think you described the look on their face as one of terror, effectively. And I mean, of course, how could it not be? I mean, how could you be exposed to difference without that being an absolutely upheaving circumstance in your life?
I have to tell you that while I have not had first contact with New Guinea adults, all the groups that I've worked with have had contact with the outside world. There were New Guinea children in remote villages who had never seen a European. And as you talk...
Were you the first one they saw?
I was the first one, and I can recall...
What an eminent introduction to the Western world. The very first person you meet from the West is Professor Jared Diamond. So, you guys must be really intelligent,
Any eminence was lost on them, especially I can picture a baby that was being held by its mother and was laughing and giggling and facing its back to me, and then the baby turned around. And within a second or two, I saw the expression on the face of the baby turn from laughter to utter horror. And the baby began screaming and then turned away.
I ought to just check whether you have that effect on Western babies as well. Okay, so we're talking about traditional societies. And although there are a few societies which remain in the world, few tribes that literally have had no first contact at all, they are the exception. And generally you're talking about traditional societies in the sense that you described with no metal tools and so on, which continue into this day, have had some first contact with the outside world, but find themselves on a trajectory of, I don't know if this is the word you would use, but modernization of some kind. And let me just check, is that modernization that you see now developing among those traditional societies, does it all adopt the same pattern, i.e. is it all becoming westernized, or are there kind of varieties of development among the people you've seen?
Interesting question, Robert. There are big differences. There are some New Guinea societies that are much more receptive to change and others that are much more traditional. I remember working in a society in the New Guinea Highlands in the 1960s where the local people were rather conservative, but there were a few people from another tribe who were much more entrepreneurial. Right. And a missionary friend of mine was at this site when the first airplane landed at the airstrip. And the local people who were rather conservative looked at the airplane and wow, 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 and then within 5 or 10 minutes they turned their backs and resumed talking about their sweet potatoes, whereas the New Guineans from an outside tribe, who were much more entrepreneurial, looked at the airplane and then asked the pilot, so how much does this cost, and how much does it cost to use, and how far can you fly? And then they did the calculation, they came to the pilot and said, we want to charter your airplane, because they had figured out wow. that they could make a profit chartering this airplane to go to an outlying place with lots of birds of paradise, buy the plumes, come back and sell them. Right. So that illustrates the broad differences between the societies.
That's interesting. I mean, in the latter case, I imagine that for us it's easy, and maybe you'll talk about this, I think it's probably easy for us to fetishize somewhat the idea of the traditional society and the kind of Rousseauist idea of going back to nature and so on. And we'll come on to that, but let's ask the question the other way around first, which is, to what extent in some of those societies is there a real envy, or desire, or jealousy of the West, or what you call the weird way of life, Western, educated, industrial, rich and democratic? Is there an active jealousy or envy or coveting that goes on?
Coveting, yes, more than jealousy and envy. Every New Guinea society that I've dealt with, they all see the advantages of some of the stuff we have. In New Guinea, talk pidgin English. The word for stuff is cargo. And New Guineans, they always want medicines. They see the advantages of being cured of malaria. They want metal axes because they see metal axes keep their edge better than stone axes. They want tin food to provide, and they want clothing.
So they're very practical things. They're not craving lifestyle necessarily, or mentality, or the way Westerners seem to behave. It's practical tools that they could assimilate to their lives to make them better.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's talk about the other way around as well, because as you know, when in the West we talk about primitive or traditional societies, it can evoke feelings of guilt? Are we being, colonialist or neo-colonialist in the way we describe people? Are we being condescending and so on? I mean, from your experience, it would help me, perhaps to help the audience, to understand a bit better what a good disposition might be towards people of those societies, because one clearly doesn't want to write them off as crude savages. On the other hand, one doesn't want to sort of fetishize them as the answer, the sort of the Rousseau naturalist answer to all our worries. And yet we have very little, for those of us who haven't lived among these people, have very little knowledge of them. So can you help us to understand what our sort of disposition towards them might be?
The disposition that I adopt in New Guinea avoids the two extremes that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
There are many people, many well-meaning liberal people today who adopt a Rousseauist attitude and believe that traditional people have wisdom, they love the environment, they're free of all the vices that beset modern civilization. There are lots of people whom one would pejoratively refer to as racists, who instead believe that traditional societies are primitive, that they are mentally primitive, that they should be killed or brought into the modern world or pushed out of the way as quickly as possible. In my work with New Guineans, I went out there naive, not knowing what they would be like, and my first impression was they're people like us. They laugh, they cry, they're scared when I laugh, cry, and scared. So my first impression was people are people everywhere, and then gradually I realized that there are big differences. They have different concepts of friendship, they have different approaches to marriage, they have different relationships to young people and old people. So the fascinating thing for me about being in New Guinea is that they're people whom I can understand at one level, and then in other ways, even after years, they surprise me.
Yeah. I mean, we'll come on to kind of some of the more specific details that you talk about, especially in terms of how to bring up children, how people deal with justice and so on, and aging. But just sort of staying at this broader level for a little while longer, I wanted to ask you then, if we've talked about the word traditional, just to understand the word society, because it's clearly a critical word, and one to not be taken that lightly, and there are all sorts of assumptions we might make about the word society. And one way into this might be that reading your book, I get the impression that if you belong to a traditional society, you absolutely belong. In other words, the space for the individual is much more limited than it might be, for example, in the society we live in London or in the United States. In other words, we feel in the West that, at least in principle, we might be able to not agree with the society, to stand apart from it, to cherish our own individualism and express dissent or not belonging to the society we find ourselves, perhaps even arbitrarily, part of. But I get the sense from you that when you talk about society, particularly in the traditional society environment, you're talking about environments or cultures in which it's not possible to not belong. So society is different from what it is in the West. Society, we almost are able to look at it over there from our position here as individuals. But if I'm right in understanding you, in the traditional societies you talk about, that's simply not the case. You're entirely subsumed or enveloped in the society. So the society is everything rather than an option.
You're absolutely correct. In fact, it's inconceivable that you not belong. A New Guinean will identify himself or herself at several levels of belonging. First, he or she will say, I am a member of this clan.
Yeah.
And then he or she will say, then I'm a member of this clan in this village. And then the next, he or she will identify the language group. I am a Gimi, I am a Foray. And then most recently, and then they may say, and I'm a dweller of Southern Highlands province. And then most recently, because the Papua New Guinea state has existed only since 1975, the PNG state has been working hard at telling New Guineans in Pidgin English, you me all get up along one pella country. We are all New Guineans. But it takes work to do that because people first, when asked who you are, they don't say, I'm a New Guinean. They'll say, I'm an Awa clan of the Miarasa village, of the Foray language group in the Eastern Highlands.
You see, I would find that absolutely stifling. I mean, if I had to say, you know, I am part of this family, and I think my family is pretty weird, you know, and I'm part of this class. I have some very, you know, ambiguous feelings about the class to which I belong. I'm from this background, you know, which is public school, Oxford, you know, and I have some ambivalent feelings about that. If I had to stand up and identify myself again and again in a non-ironic or non-critical way with those things, it would cause me to feel a considerable amount of discomfort, as though my sort of individualism or my ability to determine myself was suddenly taken away from me. But I suppose that doesn't apply in what you've described. The idea of self-determinism, I would imagine, would be a somewhat unusual concept.
You're touching on a big issue and a dilemma for New Guineans who move from their tribal village into the capital, say Port Moresby, to get a job. So they're uprooting themselves from their tribal identity. They're now living in the capital where there are hundreds of language groups. They're losing the communal identity. At the same time, the communal identity is reassuring from Port Moresby. They can go back to the village where they know that they fit in. When they go back to the village, there's support on the one hand, there are obligations on the other hand. And just as an example, the New Guinean to whom I dedicated my book, who she's educated, a lawyer, became PNG's ambassador to the United States. And for a long time, I've been talking with her about whether she'll go back or whether she'll stay in the United States. She's decided that she'll go back to New Guinea, but she said the thing that she likes about the United States, she loves New Guinea, she's got all the ties, but what she most likes about the United States is that she can sit down at a sidewalk cafe in Washington, D.C., order her coffee, read the newspaper, and nobody is going to come up to her and say, oh, I've got troubles, can you give me some money? That's to say she enjoys the anonymity, but she also treasures the connections.
So that's a kind of best of both worlds scenario, but would it be true to say then that in these traditional societies there's no sense of self, that, you know, the tribe, the clan, the belonging group always precedes or takes precedence over the self, and that in fact a concept of the self would be sort of anomalous in some way?
I would phrase it differently. There is a sense of self. Individuals differ in New Guinea as much as they differ in the United States or in the UK, but there's the nexus of obligations with which you've been brought up. And interestingly, I had thought of the obligations as being something voluntary, something embraced, that New Guineans from a given group love to help each other. And it was therefore an eye-opener to me when on one occasion I brought a Highlander from his village to a Highland town, and I was going to buy him some things, and I asked, are you going to share all this, bring this back and share it with your fellow clanspeople? And his response was a blunt response: share it with my fellow clanspeople, my relatives, those no good, lazy, good for nothings? No, I worked hard and I'm going to get it for myself. And so it illustrates that the communality, partly it's because life is out in the open. Everything is visible, and so you have to share. Yeah. But if you're given the opportunity, you take it for yourself. And so New Guineans nowadays, they love trousers with pockets, and they love opaque bags because they can hide stuff from their relatives.
That's funny. That's funny. So I guess it's impossible to be private in that situation, isn't it?
That's true.
There's no kind of place to withdraw. I mean, how does that work in practice? I mean, privacy is something we treasure in the West, even though it's becoming more and more difficult to preserve. I mean, how do people, without putting too fine a point on it, how do people have kind of an intimate life with one another?
Let's go straight to the example. What does one do about having sex in such a society?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Well, children up to the age of 6, share the mat with their parents.
Yeah.
And I read an account, I think it happened to be for a Polynesian society, but it could be for anywhere around the world. So the parents have sex on the mat, and the babies are there next to them. And if the baby looks up, then the parent will say to the baby, pull the blanket over your head and don't look.
Right.
Would you?
There's all sorts of reactions to that, aren't there? And that, okay.
You did say you have a 7-year-old son.
A daughter, yes. But the thought of having, anyway. Interesting, very interesting. But again, that sort of plays to this idea that there's no individual that isn't sort of part of a group. You're in play, as it were, all the time, aren't you? You're kind of in play. Well, let's, sort of having touched on some of those broader themes, I wonder if we can zoom in a bit and consider, as it were, the lifespan that one might have in these two contrasting environments, a traditional one and a Western one. So sort of going from birth to aging, because and maybe we can touch at some points along the way, like in terms of how people deal with risk or justice and so on, diet in particular. Because it's interesting, I mean, you talk about different approaches to child rearing in the two different environments. And I'm conscious, as you say, I've got a 7-year-old, and I'm conscious, because I've also got older children too, I'm conscious of how much kind of almost paranoia there seems to be in kind of London, in kind of middle-class environments about child rearing. And it's more like sort of training athletes for, to be perfect in some way. They've got to have the piano lessons, the violin lessons, the extra math. And so, I mean, it's quite an intense, sort of almost factory-based approach to producing perfection. And it's sort of pretty transactional, and it seems to me getting worse. And the idea, I mean, I was telling Jared beforehand, this anecdote I overheard in the school playground, a mother talking to another mother saying, actually, I better change the name of the child involved. Let's call her Alice. Yes, we know what we want for Alice. We want her to read economics at Harvard. It's a 7-year-old child. So, pretty terrible, but I think probably not entirely unusual. And it's, I think, what some parents are thinking, if not they're actually expressing. So when you hear that, Jared, I mean, how does that make you feel, and what does that make you think of in terms of the contrast between the two cultures?
This is one of the areas where living and working in New Guinea has most influenced my personal life, namely my approach to having brought up, my wife and I, bringing up our children. There's, of course, diversity in how children are brought up in traditional society, just as there is in modern state societies. But a generalization is that children in traditional societies, small-scale societies, are given far more independence. They're allowed to make their own decisions. And an extreme example is that in the New Guinea Highlands, when I started to work there, I was struck by the fact that most New Guinea Highlanders have fire scars on their arms, and I thought that it was because
children, you're saying?
Adults have fire scars, and I thought that they had acquired this as adults making fires, but no, many of these fire scars, most of them, are acquired from babies playing close to the fire, and the attitude of the parents is, it's for that baby to decide, and the baby will have to learn. Well, that goes further. My wife and I did not let our children play next to fires, but we did leave our children as much freedom as possible to make their choices. And an example, I was telling you beforehand about my son's career choice. That son at age 3 saw his first snake, and it was love at first sight. It was a dead snake. My wife and I are not snake lovers, but Max loved that snake. He picked it up, he carried it around for 2 weeks. He then wanted a pet snake. All right, a child is not to be denied if we're not going to get him a poisonous rattlesnake. But we bought him a snake and then another, and eventually Max built up to 147 pet snakes, frogs, reptiles, amphibians, lizards, and salamanders.
Right.
But this is a boy who got used to making his own choices. And as I was telling you, when Marie and I were on a vacation just after he had graduated college and he had not made a career choice, one day while we were on a ship and $15 per minute shipped to shore phone. Max called us up and said, I've decided I'm going to become a chef, and tomorrow I want to enter culinary school, and I need to write a check. Will you write the check? Well, this is a boy who made his own, who we had raised him to make his own choices.
I resonate with being asked to write a check, I have to say. Okay, so, but doesn't that take us to veering a bit towards one of the extremes we talked about earlier, which is sort of rather idealizing these traditional societies? You know, the children run wild, they spontaneously develop, they're incredibly creative. Yes, they may get a little bit burned every now and then, but in the grand scheme of things, you know, they don't die, so let them run free. So are we skirting a bit too close to that, perhaps idealized vision?
The reality is reasonably close to what you describe. It's not that the children don't die. Sadly, maybe half of children in traditional New Guinea or Africa die, but not of fires and knives. They die particularly of infectious diseases or starvation or unavoidable accidents. But it is true that the degree of independence is far greater. And most people who've lived in traditional societies, whether Africa, New Guinea, or somewhere else, are struck by the self-confidence, the independence, the ability to make their own choices of children 5 or 10 years old. And I'll give you just a story to illustrate it. I was in a village in New Guinea where we had lost our porters. We needed porters to get on to the next village, and most of the adults, the men, were out of the village, so I had to hire as porters anybody who would volunteer. There was a 10-year boy, I estimate him 10 years old, who volunteered to carry goods for us and was going to be for a week. Well, his parents weren't around, but this is a 10-year-old boy who can make his own decisions. So he went off with a white man, and when his parents came back, they would have been told that their son went off with some white man in this direction. At the end of the week of carrying stuff, I needed to hire 1 or 2 people to help me with my work on birds, and this 10-year-old again volunteered. So instead of coming back in a week, as his parents thought, he came back a month later.
Wow.
And as far as his parents were, New Guinea parents, their view is, we've raised that child to be independent, and he can decide for himself, and he can size up the white man. But he negotiated with me. A 10-year-old child, or even a 5-year-old child, negotiates with me from a posture of self-confidence. And certainly my own children at age 5 would not have been able to negotiate a job.
Right. That's an extraordinary example, isn't it? I think this brings us onto the area of how kind of risk is managed in life, because I think one of the things that drives us in the West to be perhaps overprotective with our children and to keep them indoors rather than playing on the street is because of a kind of Daily Mail sort of paranoia. We've developed this idea that, you know, if we let our children play on the street, they'll immediately be seized by a paedophile and we won't ever see them again. You know, there's a kind of generalized paranoia about this, or if not that they'll be mugged, or they'll get run over, or if they go and play in the garden, that they'll get stung. You know, it's as if we see the childhood environments that our children play in as sort of kind of fraught with danger, and it makes us, you know, correspondingly risk averse. But I assume you're not saying that in traditional societies people have no sense of risk. They just think, well, children are fine, they'll get on with it. Because presumably there's as much danger in the societies you're describing as there is in the ones, real or unreal, that we find in the West. So what's going on with that? How do people deal with danger in those circumstances?
You are correct that, of course, there's danger in New Guinea just as there's danger in the United States. The dangers are different in New Guinea or in traditional or in Africa. The dangers are especially environmental dangers, lions, crocodiles, stinging insects. In our sanitized Western world, we've tamed the environment, so environmental dangers are less severe. There are the dangers of infectious diseases, which we've tamed. We face different dangers, cars, for example. But it's not just that we've traded one set of dangers for another set. It's that the overall level of danger in New Guinea is higher than in the UK.
And let me check. So it's because I think there's a distinction between real and perceived danger. Certainly, in the case of child rearing in this country, I think the perceived danger is much greater than the real danger. Are you talking in the New Guinea example about, you were talking about real danger and that people don't, as it were, bump up the danger through perception in the way that we do in the West?
Correct. The real level of danger in New Guinea is higher than in the UK for two reasons.
Yeah.
It's measured by shorter lifespan. Traditionally, they would die at 45 or 50. We die at 77 or 80. So the level of mortal danger per year is higher in New Guinea. And the other difference is that dangers in the UK and in the US, damage can often be repaired, whereas in New Guinea it cannot be repaired. The one occasion when I broke a leg bone in the US, it was crossing Harvard Square in Cambridge, Mass. On the ice. I stumbled over to a telephone, rang my physician father, who picked me up, my leg got set, and I was okay for the rest of my life. Whereas in New Guinea, if you break a leg, on one occasion in New Guinea when I injured a leg, I was 20 miles from the coast, and there was no way that I was going to be able to walk out if I had not recovered. In addition, if you break a bone in New Guinea, there are not experienced surgeons who will set it. And so not only may you not be able to walk out, but if you do somehow walk out, you're likely to end up crippled for the rest of your life. So New Guineans are more alert to danger than we are.
Yes. I mean, one of the things we'll do before we close this part of the discussion is try and capture, I guess, some of the kind of lessons that we can learn from these societies. And we were chatting earlier, and I think it comes up in the book, about just sort of very simple things we can do, like being much more careful in the shower than we might otherwise be, because actually our chance of slipping over in the shower and hurting ourselves is infinitely greater than getting blown up in an aircraft, for example. In fact, it happened to me. I slipped over in the shower when I was in my 20s. It was a serious accident.
All you have to do is to read the obituary column or the necrology column of any newspaper any day, and you will see that one of the commonest causes of either death or crippling or loss of quality of life for older people is falling in the shower or on a stepladder or on the sidewalk or going up and down stairs. I have already done today the most dangerous thing that I will do all day today, namely I took a shower in my hotel bathroom, which is not very well designed. And you might say, well, Jared, that's ridiculous. Your chances of slipping in the shower are only 1 in 1,000. To which I would respond, 1 in 1,000 isn't good enough. Just do the numbers. So I'm 76. My life expectancy now is 15 years. That means daily showers, I have 5,475 showers ahead of me. And if my risk of falling and crippling myself in the shower is as high as 1 in 1,000, I'm going to kill myself 5 times before I live out my life expectancy. So I have learned to be really careful about showers. You may have noticed my holding on to the banister as I walked in here, because those are the real dangers of our everyday life, not terrorists, not plane crashes, but showers, stepladders, alcohol, cars.
It's basically how I live my life. So I'm very pleased to see the inner nerd in you come out in those statistics as well. But clearly there is nevertheless danger in those societies. And you mentioned right at the beginning, we're having a conversation here without us killing one another, right? Yeah. So presumably, okay, you might not slip over in the shower, but the chances of actually being killed by somebody from another group are real. Mm-hmm. So it's probably a more glamorous ending than slipping down the stairs, I would imagine. But
it's more likely to make the newspaper.
Yeah.
But it is true that if you're in a society, a sedentary society where you know your own group and you know the people next door, a stranger really does mean danger. And so the antennae go up.
Yeah.
Again, one of the most profound lessons that I learned from New Guineans, it came out of an incident. Early in my career in New Guinea, I was with New Guineans studying birds. We were moving up a mountain. I was picking a new campsite, and so I picked a campsite in a broad place in a ridge that would be great for bird watching under a gigantic, beautiful tree, and there was a drop-off where I could see swifts and parrots and pigeons, and I told the New Guineans, let's make camp here. And to my surprise, they were frightened. They said, we're not going to sleep under this tree. What's the matter? This tree is dead. So I looked up, and yes, the tree is dead, but it's colossal. And I said, this tree isn't going to fall down for 40 years. No, they would not sleep under the tree. They would rather sleep in the open. And at first I thought they were being paranoid with exaggerated fears. But as time went on, every night that I sleep in the New Guinea jungle, you can hear somewheres a tree falling. Right. And then I did the numbers. And if every night you sleep under a dead tree, and if the chances of the dead tree falling on you that night are only 1 in 1,000, but you do it every night in 3 years, 1,095, you'll be dead.
So the dangers are real, and the killing is real. And I was fascinated to read about how people deal with the consequences, how they deal with disputes and killings and, tension between different tribes and clans and other groupings and so on. And we were chatting about this earlier, because I think there really are some lessons to be learned here about the difference between Western approaches to justice and the other approaches that you describe in the book. Because, broadly speaking, in the West, we think justice is the answer. If there's been a breach of some kind, we deal with it through justice. And justice is, in theory, a way of kind of balancing the scales. But it's quite it's obviously legalistic, and it's quite a cognitive approach, or sort of almost analytic approach to the aftermath of a breach or a disaster or whatever it might be. Something's gone wrong there, so we must even it up with that. There's a crime and there's a punishment, and that's how we sort of see it in the West, almost as literally as a kind of analytical balance. But it's very striking reading what you had to say in this and talking with you earlier, that there are some costs and consequences to that approach, which is that the opportunity to move on for healing is much less taken care of. So there's no kind of therapeutic element, if you like, or no restorative element in justice seen in that very crude way. So I think it would be interesting for us to hear a little bit more how we might learn from dealing with, let's call them breaches, crimes, or what have you, in a way which is perhaps more human and allows people to move on, and whether or not that's only possible because those societies are smaller and people have to live with one another and get on with one another, and therefore wouldn't apply to the West anyway. So 2 questions in one there. But
sure.
Yeah.
This is a good example, because here's an area, we've talked about areas where I can learn as an individual from New Guineans about bringing up children levels of danger. But there are also areas which we cannot adopt as individuals, but it's instead that our society has to adopt them. So justice in the UK and in the US is administered by the state, and its concern is right or wrong, and making amends, and asserting the authority of the state. If you are wronged, you are not permitted to take revenge yourself. You turn it over to the state. Because many of the things that
and in fact, sorry to interrupt, but in a certain sense, that's sort of how we define civilization in the West. It's precisely not wild justice. It's, I might want to get my own back on you, but actually, I'm not going to do that. We sublimate things through the state. It's almost like a Hobbes or something. There's a higher authority which enables us to be civilized. It's precisely that. Without that, we might be savages, quotes unquotes.
Yeah, one can define the state as centralized organization that arose in order to monopolize force, and in order to justify doing that, to assert the practice of justice. And many of our encounters, many of the rights and wrongs we encounter are with strangers that we never saw before and will never see again. But anybody in the UK or the US who's been involved in a divorce or an inheritance dispute, you know perfectly well that the court system doesn't care a bit about emotional reconciliation. It cares about right and wrong and alimony and child support and who gets the inheritance. And the result, tragically, is usually that the divorcing couple end up hating each other, or that the brother and sister in the inheritance dispute end up unable to speak to each other for the rest of their life. Whereas in New Guinea, in traditional societies, the purpose of resolving disputes because those people are going to be around you for the rest of your life. The interest is not in right or wrong, but the interest is in restoring relationships so you can deal with that person forever.
Yeah.
And an extreme example that surprised me was that a friend of mine, New Guinea friend of mine, described to me that his father was killed by the next group when his mother was pregnant with him. And there was fighting that went on so that his group left their ancestral lands. And finally, 25 years later, they achieved a reconciliation that let them come back to the ancestral lands. The reconciliation, my friend said, consisted of us holding a feast and giving them pigs. And I thought, I'm misunderstanding you. Why on earth are you giving them pigs when they killed your father and other people? And he said, well, they also had their own complaints that we were trespassing on their land. But the purpose of the whole operation was to restore feelings so that we could get back to our ancestral lands. It was not a pretense of determining right or wrong,
yes,
but it was of restoring relationships so we could then live the rest of our lives in peace.
Okay, but then to the second question, maybe that's only possible because those are smaller societies, whereas, in the West, I don't have any statistics at my fingertips, that although lots of people are killed by people who know them, it's often the case that people are killed by complete strangers. And so the imperative for restoration is somewhat weaker because the chances of being in that community with that person for a long period of time are lower. Is that right?
You are correct that the personal imperative for restoring a relationship is weak or non-existent because the dispute or crime involves someone that you never saw and will never see again. But the emotional consequences are with you for life.
Yeah.
I have one friend whose sister was murdered 50 years ago, and the killers were sent to prison, and my friend 50 years later is still tortured by the murder of his sister because there was no emotional confrontation or reconciliation.
Yeah.
There's a movement that in the UK, I think better than we it's called Restorative Justice, which brings together victims of crimes or the survivors of the victims with criminals to see each other face to face and to see that the criminal is not an ogre but is a person that had his or her own reasons for doing it, and that the victim is not some inconsequential person, but that I did that harm, that widow, by killing that man, I made her life miserable. And the restorative justice system is reasonably well developed in New Zealand and Canada and somewhat in the UK, and it's starting in the US.
I think I mentioned to you earlier that I'm involved in this, it's like a sort of group therapy thing called Constellations. And one of the things that comes up again and again in that is that when a murder takes place, a bond is created between perpetrator and victim, which is as strong as any bond created in any other kind of, as it were, normal walk of life, and that it doesn't go away. So anyway, I'm conscious of time, and I want us to talk a little bit before handing over to the audience about kind of later life and how we deal with aging and so on. And of course, en route to that, and you've mentioned life expectancy, are lifestyle factors like diet, and how that affects longevity positively or negatively. And one of the facts that stuck out for me from many facts that you've enumerated in the book is this one about the pizza. Do you remember this? There's more salt in one pizza than there is in the entire yearly intake of somebody from Papua New Guinea. Have I remembered that correctly?
That is true, and in particular there is a restaurant in Orange County where the food inspectors measured the amount of salt in a noodle meal, and it was 18 grams, whereas for New Guinea Highlander or Yanomamo Indian, salt consumption per day is 50 milligrams, which means that noodle meal contained 1 year's worth of salt intake for New Guinea Highlander. And the consequences of that are that we get stroke and hypertension, whereas in traditional New Guinea, no one got stroke, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart disease.
Yeah. And not only that, but as you know, in the West, we now have growing concerns over an aging population. Dementia, Alzheimer's are becoming more and more prevalent in this society. We're not sure how to deal with it. We feel there's there's a resource issue, there's a finance issue, and so on. What are the things we could potentially learn from traditional societies in terms of how we might deal with our older folk?
The most surprising single fact that I learned in the course of the reading for my book has to do with recent research within the last 5 years on the prognosis of Alzheimer's disease and the dimensions of old age. This went on in Toronto, Canada. So Alzheimer's and the old age dementia, they're feared because they seem to be unstoppable. There's nothing you can do about them. People talk about playing bridge or Sudoku, but the fact is there's no evidence. Until recently, there's been no evidence that anything protected you against the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease until a study in Toronto in a old people's homes showed that the one predictor is that bilingual or multilingual people get on the if they're going to get Alzheimer's, they get on the average 5 years of protection against the symptoms of Alzheimer's. The reason is that, of course, being bilingual or multilingual is the most constant exercise you can have for the brain. What we don't know is whether a multilingual person with 10 languages gets only 5 years of protection, as does a bilingual. I have a personal interest in this because with 13 languages, I would get 65 years of protection. But if it maxes out at bilingualism, then my other 11 languages are doing me no good.
So the fact I can ask for a beer in German adds a few minutes to my life, but the fact I'm drinking the beer takes it off at the same time.
The fact that you can ask for a beer in German brings you two great benefits. One is you're drinking the greatest beers of the world, with due respect to the UK, and the other is that your ability to do this will give you 5 years protection in case, God forbid, etc.
Thank you. Okay, Jared, it's been fascinating, this part of the discussion. We've moved from a kind of general discussion about what we mean by society, what we mean by traditional, whether we should idealize, not idealize, what lessons we can learn. We've talked a little bit about sort of life stages, if you like, bringing up children, dealing with dispute, and getting older, and so on. So we've done a bit of an arc, and I'm sure through that conversation there'll be lots of things that have come up in the minds of the audience. Questions and themes and so on. So what I suggest is now for the next 20 minutes or so, we turn to the audience, and if you're happy to take questions from them, we'll run it like that until 9 o'clock.
Hello, Professor Jared. I'm a Portuguese, 30-year-old girl, and I have two questions. One, what about the sense of belonging in the societies you saw in New Guinea? Is it different? Do people get more mental or psychiatric conditions, or do you see them some disturbances? Because Western society, it's increasingly often. Second, it would have to do with how do they deal with sexuality? I mean, prejudice, I don't know the right word for preconception. I'm not English, so how do they deal with difference?
Do you mean discrimination against women? Yes,
discrimination.
Right.
Not only women, but also against sexuality itself.
Okay.
So that would be my two questions.
Yeah. These are both very interesting questions. To take the first one, sense of belonging and the consequence for people who lack a sense of belonging of psychiatric conditions. I've often asked friends who are physicians or psychiatrists who have experience in traditional societies whether the frequency of mental disorders is higher, lower, or different mental disorders. And the answer they give me is, we don't know. The reason we don't know is the difficulty of diagnosing bipolar conditions or other mental disorders in a New Guinea society compared to a Western society. What I can say from my observation is that in New Guinea, often I see in villages people who the villagers themselves recognize as being, they would say, long. That's to say, the person has a mental problem. but the person is nevertheless integrated within village life and does what he or she can. So that's the first question. And the second question, sexuality and prejudice, varies enormously among traditional societies. Things that vary are the treatment of women, heterosexuality versus homosexuality, child sexuality. It's difficult to generalize. The only generalization is that there was a study that looked at the role of women in many respects in traditional societies. And it turns out that there's not a single role of women. It's not the case that a society treats women badly across the board or treats them well across the board. Women may have more economic power and less social power. They have more child-rearing power. A general pattern is that women in most traditional societies have more authority as regards the younger children, and the involvement of the men may be stronger after age 6, but in short, there's just enormous variation in sexuality. So these are two important questions, both of which would have been worth a chapter in my book. Be grateful that my book is already long.
I want to ask you a question which touches on the territory that you've explored in your books, and it's quite a complicated question, but it's to do with dealing with some of the issues of the limits of our planet and the environmental issue. Human nature, human societies are really formed and structured by the essential requirements of living in an environment, acquiring security, acquiring goods, sugar, fats, etc., and that's a driver of our consumption pattern. But in a sense, we need to transcend that way of being and living our lives, and we need to actually sublimate or suppress out those drives to achieve a balance in a limited system. And you looked at this a bit in Collapse. But what are your thoughts about how we can actually solve that problem, the limits of our planet, but our unlimited desire for consumption and security?
A shameless author would recommend that you read my book, Collapse, but that would be utterly shameless, and I need to say something worthwhile to you now. So one thing that's will be useful in getting us to a sustainable economy. And we've got to get to a sustainable economy in the next 40 years, because if we don't, we're finished at the rate that we're depleting resources at the moment. Important is for people to feel the consequences of their own environmental mistakes. That's to say, their own overconsumption. And for example, when I look at past societies that have messed up their environments and declined as a result, the ancient Maya, the Khmer, Easter Islanders, and so on. And when I look at societies that have managed their resources successfully for millennia after millennia, Japan, Tikopia, Iceland, the New Guinea Highlands, and when I ask, are there any consistent differences? One difference seems to me that societies in which the elite, the leaders, feel the consequences of their own environmental mistakes are more likely to adopt sound environmental policies, whereas if the leaders can insulate themselves from the consequences of their actions, they may go on exploiting the environment, and the commoners may then be suffering increasingly, but the kings may still have enough food until it's too late, as happened with the Maya. And that, of course, it's a worldwide problem today, because when one compares the first world and the developing world, consumption rates in the first world, in the UK and US, are something like 32 times those in the developing world, but the first world is not yet suffering the consequences of its overexploitation. And what we need to do, to get us onto a sustainable path, we in the first world need to suffer the consequences of our destroying the environmental resources on which we depend.
It's interesting that that doesn't necessarily apply in the case of obesity, which is a direct form of overconsumption. Yeah. I mean, there's a direct consequence of eating too much, which is you get fat. So you're faced with it pretty immediately, and yet we have obese societies where it seems to be the norm. and accepted, in fact. And part of your belonging is to look the same as everybody else.
This illustrates the fact that for individuals as for societies, knowledge of what is good good for you or for the society doesn't mean that you will do what is good for you or for the society. There's now widespread information from public health about the importance of a healthy diet, and nevertheless, the frequency of diabetes in the UK and US, it's type 2, it's 7 to 9%, but diabetes is exploding in India and China and in the Mideast, and it's exploding because those societies are acquiring affluence, the ability to get onto a Western diet, before they've acquired the public health knowledge of how the Western diet is bad for them. And so you have the irony that in India and China, diabetes particularly afflicts wealthy urban people, whereas in the UK and US, diabetes particularly affects poor rural people.
Two things I'd really like your observations on. The first is when you stated that society has become more enclosed, and certainly with the tribes in New Guinea, they identify themselves by their name and the village they come from. And Robert, you mentioned that you find that quite frustrating and enclosed. And I would argue that we actually identify ourselves on a daily basis with branded labels, the car we drive, the area we choose to live in. So I'd like your comments on that. And the second thing is, with regard to learned dangers, I think we all learn dangers, but I would query the fact that we probably take less responsibility for learning dangers in Western society because our lives are more and more complicated on a daily basis. Whereas in New Guinea, arguably, lives are more simplistic, but they rely more heavily on instinct, learned instinct.
Two very interesting questions. As regards identity, identity in traditional societies is a social identity that refers to the group into which you were born or into which you marry. And so at various levels, the identity is your clan, your village, your tribe, your language group, and nowadays your nation. Whereas the types of identity that you mentioned, they're real types of identity. There are people who identified themselves, as I used to, as a Volkswagen owner, and I certainly identify myself as a Bostonian, as a Boston Red Sox fan and a Yankee hater. But those are acquired identities. They're not born or marital social groupings. That's the difference in identity. The second thing about less responsibility, it's a very interesting point that you mentioned. The reality is that the dangers that we face, many of the dangers, the real dangers for us in the UK and the US are mostly dangers that are under our control. We worry about terrorists and GM crops and things done to us. But really, the main dangers that we face are alcohol, slipping, and so on. The average person, this is going to sound funny, but if you ask the average person, what is your risk of having a car accident? The average person will say, my risk of having a car accident is lower than the average person because I drive carefully. That's to say, for things that are under our control, we minimize the risk because we think that we are careful, and yet by definition, the average person faces an average risk.
You've mentioned a couple of times how with identity, in effect, borders and countries. The concept of borders and countries is a relatively, in our evolution, recent thing. And somehow the concept hasn't evolved because it came with cartographers who knew how to draw lines. And boundaries don't move that much. I know they do a little sometimes. What is your view in terms of the way societies have evolved about boundaries?
Very interesting question, and it's something that I wrestled with in the first chapter of my book. We are accustomed, we in state-level societies, are accustomed to define boundaries that are surveyed and there are customs posts and and controls at the borders. In traditional societies, boundaries range all the way from as fixed as in modern state-level societies to very fluid. Cases where traditional societies that have well-defined boundaries tend to be densely populated, sedentary societies that have valuable stuff to protect, such as pigs or fields, and a large enough population that you can devote some men to patrolling the boundary. And so, for example, for the Danai people of the Ballon Valley of Western New Guinea, the boundaries are sufficiently well-defined that traditional Danai put up watchtowers at the boundary, and some men would spend all day in the watchtowers looking out to see whether people from the other side were going to come sneak across. So those are boundaries as well defined as the boundary between France and Germany. At the opposite extreme, societies living at low population densities that are mobile, where there's not valuable stuff to defend, tend to have rather fluid boundaries. That's to say, each group may have its home base and may have first rights to a certain area, but other people can come into that area on a reciprocal sharing basis. So, for example, for the Kung people of the Kalahari Desert, waterholes would be owned, but in a dry year when many waterholes dry up, the people over there can come use your waterhole, but in return, the expectation is that when their mangongo nuts are producing, you then have the reciprocal right to go harvest their mangongo nuts. So a short answer then is that the boundaries in traditional societies run the whole spectrum from as strict as in modern state-level societies to quite fluid, but always based on shared relationships and sharing.
As opposed to state definition.
As opposed to state definition. In the case of the Danai of the Ballon Valley, there is no state, but each tribe would nevertheless define its area, and it patrols it with those watchtowers.
I'd love to hear you talk a bit about happiness. Many of us have probably had the experience where we'll meet, in my case, with African societies where they seem to laugh more easily and sing more easily, but they have a greater chance of their children dying by one or dying in childbirth, and it's hard to equate those terms.
Good question. Perhaps the best answer I can give to that is a one-sentence answer that a friend of mine, a cultural anthropologist, who's worked for decades in an interior country of Africa, said about comparing the lives of rural Africans with the lives of Americans. He summed it up by saying, their lives in Africa are materially poorer but socially richer than our lives, meaning that they have their lifelong friendships, they have their relationships, they have their material poverty, they have misery from more deaths of children, but the phenomenon of loneliness, particularly loneliness in old age, is non-existent in a sedentary traditional society.
Oh, hi. I've just come back from a remote part of Australia called Katherine in the Northern Territory. So I've got two questions. The first one is about the dreaming and whether in Papua New Guinea they have a similar way of organising and communicating spirituality. And the second one is about, you might not want to answer, you might not have time to answer both of them, but the second one's about how when a generation of Indigenous people leave their community, what's the relationship in your experience of the second and third generations when they go back to their land and their spiritual beliefs?
On the first question about spirituality, virtually all societies, especially all traditional societies, have something that can be identified as religion. One can get a debate about defining religion. My long chapter on religion has a table of 1.5 pages with 13 different definitions of religion, but virtually all traditional societies have something that we would recognize as religion, whether it's defined by belief in a supernatural, whether it's defined as the power of certain acts producing certain results. The term dreaming is a term applied particularly to Aboriginal Australian spiritual beliefs. The term dreaming is not applied in New Guinea, but nevertheless the spiritual beliefs in New Guinea are within the general framework of spiritual beliefs in Australia. That's to say there are religious beliefs. The second question about going back after 2 or 3 generations, that's rare in traditional societies. Going back after 1 generation, my friend whom I mentioned, whose father had been killed while he was in utero in his mother, his group returned after 1 generation. I am trying to think of any New Guinea group that returned after 2 or 3 generations. Certainly New Guinea groups have their tribal memories, and they'll remember that we were driven out of that land a couple of generations ago, but it's unusual, at least in my experience, for New Guineans to make the effort to recover land of 3 generations ago in the way that I saw the effort to recover their land of 1 generation ago.
What about atheism, Jared? I mean, my assumption, but it's worth testing, is that atheism is very much a Western phenomenon. Is there such a thing as atheism in traditional societies?
I am not aware, partly it depends upon the definition, but I'm not aware of any traditional society that lacks something that we would call religious beliefs. The religious beliefs we might not identify with a god. In traditional New Guinea societies, people don't talk about gods. There are other societies that they would talk about God. There would be talk about spirits, there would be talk about their ancestors, there would be talk about their ancestors going up to the sky and then coming back in the form of birds. But in this, if you define atheism as a lack of what we would recognize as religious beliefs, I'm not aware of any traditional society that's atheist.
How do traditional societies perceive success?
This is a great question to end on, I think. Thank you very much. How do traditional societies perceive success?
Wow. As you see, I'm having to think about that. In New Guinea Highland society, individual success among many New Guinea Highland societies, individual success for a man would be marked by how many pigs you've accumulated and how many wives you've accumulated.
There we go again.
Well, yeah.
I think we just need to clear this up.
More wives mean that you can produce more pigs. More pigs mean that you can buy more wives. So for a man, that's the mark of success. For a woman, I've not heard of marks of success for women. That may be because of the paucity of female anthropologists who've asked about things such as success. I would guess that women would measure success by their ability in the garden, by how much crops they can bring home, by their rearing of their children, and then success at the societal level. Success would be measured by whether you've succeeded in defeating the neighboring groups and whether you've succeeded in acquiring more land. So I guess, I'm evolving my answer to your interesting question. It's the success would be defined differently at the individual level and at the group level, and would be defined differently for men and for women.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. We're going to have to bring things to a close. The witching hour is upon us. Jared, I just want to say to you, thank you so much for your generosity in the ideas you've shared with us and the spirit in which you've answered them. Thank you very much indeed.